Welcome to the PR Maven Podcast, a podcast all about growing your network and building your brand through traditional and digital networking techniques. I'm Nancy Marshall, the PR Maven and CEO of Marshall Communications. I've been strengthening brands through PR for over 35 years, and now I'm celebrating the success of executives, influencers, business owners, and entrepreneurs from all around the world, all of whom have cultivated their brands and broadened their networks through traditional and digital networking methods. Each week, I interview one of these interesting and influential individuals and provide an opportunity for you, the PR Maven Nation, to gain insights from their strategies and stories. So stay tuned for this week's episode, and thanks for listening. Welcome, PR Maven Nation. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Nancy Marshall, the PR Maven, and I've been working in PR and personal branding for nearly 4 decades. It's a long time. And I'm here today with an old friend, Deirdre Stires, and we have worked together for many years. I don't know exactly how many, but Deirdre is now the senior writer at Bates College. Welcome, Deirdre. It's nice to have you here today.
It's great to be here, Nancy.
Thanks. So Deirdre Stires worked for 27 years as a journalist in Maine, first at the Bangor Daily News and then at the Portland Press Herald. Many newspaper readers in Maine know her by her byline, which is Deirdre Fleming. But Deirdre also covered outdoor and environmental breaking news and wrote in-depth front-page Sunday stories on Maine's myriad outdoor activities, wildlife populations, conservation efforts, and trends in outdoor recreation. And I have witnessed how she can do all the various sports and is relatively fearless when it comes to trying things out in the outdoors. And I admire her for that. In 2 decades, she wrote about and experienced while reporting virtually every outdoor activity in Maine. She's won several writing awards in Maine and nationally. In 2013, she was selected as a national finalist in the Best Writing category by the Associated Press Sports Editors, which means as an outdoor writer, she beat out sports journalists across the country covering traditional sports, the ones I call the ball sports, like football, basketball, and baseball. Her first book, which will be published by Islandport Press this spring, will be one of the nation's few hiking guides on accessible trails and will highlight the current movement to build more universal access trails across the country. So Deirdre, tell us about your career and how you got into it in the first place.
So like a lot of young people, when I was in high school and college, I wanted to be a writer, and Georgetown, where I went to undergraduate, didn't have a journalism program. So I went to get my graduate degree at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, which was fantastic because the J School at Missouri runs the daily newspaper for the town of Columbia, Missouri. So for 3 semesters, I was a daily newspaper reporter while I was getting my education in grad school, and I was completely hooked as a newspaper reporter. So serendipity a few years later led me to Maine, where I started as a beat writer covering UMaine hockey at the Bangor Daily News, and then quickly became an outdoor writer. And it was the sports reporter at the Boston Globe who had told me about the UMaine hockey gig, covering UMaine hockey at the Bangor Daily News. So that's how I ended up in Maine. But again, I covering college sports and then writing the outdoors, traveling around Maine, finding outdoor stories. I was totally hooked living here and knew I had to stay. So it's kind of ironic that the kid who grew up outside New York City spent 22 years becoming something of an outdoor expert on the Maine outdoors. But I go into all of that because it's funny that I had wanted to be a writer and I ended up becoming this newspaper reporter. And I really view myself more as a storyteller. And a lot of times they're the same thing, but in daily newspapers, you're often reporting, researching, interviewing, and writing a story all in the same day, if not in 4 or 5 hours. And so you're not really writing and rewriting the way great writers do. So I really have always viewed myself as a storyteller. And I actually think I ended up in a better career than what I was sort of set out and determined to do, because traveling around Maine and researching outdoor stories and reporting outdoor stories and meeting outdoor experts all over the state was so fascinating. It never got old. I loved it. And now I've brought those storytelling skills to Bates, where I'm finding and writing stories about young people who could be tomorrow's leaders, and people doing research to try to solve some of the problems like climate change going on today. So again, it's really fascinating finding these stories and researching and reporting them. And, but I'd say now, after almost 30 years, starting as a journalist and now in communications, again, continuing as a storyteller, I feel like my career has been really a journey dedicated to storytelling.
Well, I know you personally, and I know that you're very good at listening, and you're also very curious. And I think that those skills, curiosity and listening skills, have been part of your success, because I know personally that, when you ask a question, you really do listen for the answer quite intently. And I mean, some people ask questions, but they don't really care about the answer. They're just sort of asking the question. But when you ask a question, you really want to dig deep.
Well, I'd say kind of the heart of what I've always tried to get at as a journalist. And if I was going to give advice to people in PR, people who are working public relations, or even, at Maine, there's so many small nonprofits who don't have a designated person to work in comms or to hire a public relations company. And there are people at small organizations working 4 to 5 different jobs, and maybe they serve as the spokesperson for that organization, but they're trying to get their story out and they're pitching stories to news agencies. And what I was always looking for, Nancy, and it's probably why I'm always listening so intently, is I always wanted to get an unusual story, something different, something quirky, weird, bizarre. And, ideally it's something news. It's the breaking news. Then you're the first person to get it on your website or to get it, on the front of your newspaper. But even if it's not something new, oftentimes within a story, there's something unusual or unique. And it's just, sometimes even the organizations don't realize it, and part of like a new trend. I mean, one of the last stories I did as a journalist working with Marshall Communications, if you remember, was about this time last year. And I had started out, you had pitched the story about Sugarloaf's West Mountain expansion. And at the time, Sugarloaf either had just announced it or was going to announce it. So that was great, but I couldn't work on the story right at that time. So I said I would come back to it in a few weeks. Well, lo and behold, I came back to it, and the Sun Journal had already done a story, and maybe the Associated Press had done a story. So it really wasn't news. And it wasn't something that, I wanted to report on because it had already been out there. And then 2, my editor just wasn't interested in it because it wasn't news. But at the same time, the Friends of Acadia had just announced that they had bought a B&B for employee housing. And I knew that from reporting, I knew on the ski industry, I knew that Saddleback also was going to open employee housing. So suddenly, there's this trend that seems to be happening at Maine at resort destinations, of which Sugarloaf had been a part of by buying the Herbert Hotel in Kingfield and opening that as employee housing. And this time last year, I think they were finishing their first year offering it as employee housing. So I said to you, I'm not going to pursue the West Mountain story because it's already out there in the news and there's nothing new for me to report, but I want to do this trend story. And but what was awesome was you just completely pivoted and you dropped the West Mountain story and you helped me find a source for the trend story about resort destinations in high expensive places where employees can't afford housing. And you helped find a really cool source who was staying at the Herbert Hotel and worked at Sugarloaf. I ended up going up to Sugarloaf to cover it on the ground and to find people. But the woman you found for me as a source who was staying at the Herbert Hotel was awesome. And I thought that was amazing that you just, I mean, I never talked to you about it. I assume it achieved your goal that you wanted some positive publicity for Sugarloaf, which wasn't my aim. But in the end, writing about how in this trend story, how Sugarloaf was providing employee housing was a positive for Sugarloaf. So, for me, I got a story. I expanded on a story that was growing that not a lot of news agencies had written about, and you got a little bit of publicity for Sugarloaf. So, I assumed in the end it was a win-win, which wasn't my objective. Awesome. But it was awesome that you pivoted and I turned to a different story and you just went to help me on that story.
So that leads to my next question is, as a journalist, how can PR people best support you and work with you?
How much time do we have for this question?
As much as you want.
As I started saying, so I can't speak for other journalists, but I always wanted the story that was new or different, unusual, unique, even quirky, weird. That's just in today's news market, that's what you've got to do to get the readers and to get people to click into your story and ultimately on your website. And so understanding, the perfect pitch for that kind of story is really key. And to me, it's delivering a pitch, a story pitch. You deliver what you say you're going to deliver. It's got to hook something compelling. And all of that is going to save a journalist time. And so those are sort of the elements of, for me, when I was a journalist, what I was looking for. And it sounds really obvious, but it was amazing how many times even a PR agency from somewhere around the country pitched a story that was really mundane, or, again, a small organization that couldn't afford a PR person or to hire a PR firm had pitched a really mundane story, or even just individuals would pitch from their home, a mom pitching a story that her son was hiking the AT or biking across the country or paddling down the coast. And it sounds really cold-hearted, but I'm not interested in those stories. And because outside of that person's friends or family, nobody else is interested in those stories. Toward the end of my time as a journalist, I actually sometimes somebody would call me up or email me more often, catch me by email, and I read and responded to every email. They would pitch, a really mundane, everyday story that was not news. And I would ask them lots of questions, trying to kind of find an interesting angle, something that was unusual or unique about it. And sometimes they would go and say, let me get back to you and get the answers and sort of do a little bit of research and answer my questions. And sometimes they just didn't go to the trouble. But it's like it seems really obvious, but you have to look at it from the journalist's point of view, as, especially like a newspaper. They've got to sell ads. They've got to sell subscriptions. There was a tweet that I put out once when I was a journalist that got a big ride on Twitter and got passed around a lot. And it was comparing newspapers to restaurants. And this is when people would say, oh, why can't they? I can't access the paper. I can't access the story without a subscription, people would say. Well, you don't go into a restaurant and expect to get a free meal. And along with that, the restaurants that do really well are the ones that serve meals that really are exciting and interesting and different and amazing, and just this incredible experience.
And new.
What?
And new too, right?
Right. Yeah. Especially like in a foodie town like Portland, they're always presenting something new. So that's what restaurants have to do to get the patrons in the door, to get them coming back. And newspapers have to do the same thing, news agencies. The experience of the storytelling has to be interesting and incredible. So, that's, and even I needed to pitch every story to my editor, who, it was funny because when I left the Press Herald last spring and there was a goodbye gathering at Rising Tide, before my editor left, he turned to the group we were talking to and he said, it's interesting that in most cases, editors find stories and reporters find stories. It's about 50-50. But he said in Deirdre's case, she found the story ideas almost all the time. Maybe once or twice a year he'd come up. But he sort of, one, it's that curiosity that I had, but also he sort of made me that way because he said no so many times. I had to go back out and try to find, talking to sources, try to find interesting stories. One really good example of that, of like taking a story and finding a story within a story, finding a really unusual story within a story. Just a real quick example was this time last year, I was covering, I'd been an outdoor reporter for 22 years. So it was my 21st year writing a story about opening of deer season. And, I could have just called the biologist at the state deer biologist and asked him about the deer herd or the deer hunt or new laws or how the season had changed, how the herd had changed, what the population looked like, which is the kind of things you sometimes see in like an Associated Press story, just letting people know the season is opening. But one, my editor always pushed me to get something new and different. And I wanted to, I was curious. So what I ended up doing was taking the deer harvest for every town in Maine for the last 10 years and put it in a spreadsheet to find out what towns in Maine over the last 10 years had the biggest deer harvest. And the top 5 and 10 would surprise you. Like, what do you think? Probably didn't change too much in a year, but what do you think the number one deer harvest town was in Maine?
Greenville, Rangeley.
Right. It was York, the town of York at the southern tip of Maine. And as it turns out, I didn't even realize it, but the town of York is a big town and it's got a ton of open land and a ton of land that's not posted, like Mount Agamenticus, and there's some state land there, I think, but that was the number one town. And I bring up that example because after that story ran, the managing editor at the Press Herald said that story got the paper 25 new subscriptions on that story alone. So it's looking at a mundane story that you write every year, year in and year out. You write a story on the opening of deer season, and it was finding a story within a story. And that data set didn't exist before I ran the numbers. It just was like a very kind of quirky way to sort of look at and find something that was new and different, to tell a different story about Maine deer season.
That's awesome. I love that. So a PR person can help you uncover those interesting ways to tell a story or factoids or trends that haven't necessarily been reported on already.
Definitely. And I should give a shout out. There were a handful of people, including Marshall Communications, who knew that's what I wanted, that I wanted something unusual, different. I mean, others were Mark Laddie at Inland Fisheries and Wildlife was the king of unusual outdoor stories. Melissa Kim at Maine Audubon, she is fantastic. She knew that's what I wanted. And when she heard something that was coming along the pike, that was a new plan or a new program Maine Audubon was going to have, she knew that I'd want that story. And another, Jeremy Kluke, who used to be at Maine Audubon, now is at the Nature Conservancy. He was fantastic for that. I guess, obviously, again, I can't speak to every journalist, and maybe other journalists want something different. That's what I wanted. And the PR people who knew I wanted that, I would pick up the phone whenever they called. And when I'd be interviewing them, I would stay on the phone longer to see, is there something out there that's coming along that's new or different or unusual?
Well, I think you're also telling us that all journalists are not the same too. And good PR people can keep track of what journalists are looking for, which types of stories, and also even how they like you to communicate with them. Like, you said you respond to every email, which is very, I was going to say, nice of you. I mean, a lot. I'm sure you got hundreds and hundreds of emails, so that took a lot of time. So you were very courteous to respond to everyone. But I mean, some journalists don't respond. They only, a lot of journalists, I think, just want you to respond to their questions, but they don't necessarily take the time to respond to your emails. So you were much more gracious than most journalists, I believe.
I didn't know that. I will say I might not write much, but I might either write not interested at this time, thanks, or not something I'm interested in. I did get a ton of emails, and a lot of times they would be from out of state, and I was just interested in Maine stories, right?
Right.
I mean, that was the focus. That was what the Press Herald, that was what I was charged to do, was to tell compelling outdoor stories about Maine stories. And so when people from around the country I would respond to them, but I would say, sorry, I just cover Maine stories, not interested.
Right. Well, I also think another thing that good PR people do is keep track of who they're pitching or who they're corresponding with and what they are interested in and how to best contact them. So, again, it's important to think of journalists as individuals rather than, it's not like one size fits all. The journalists are all different personalities and interests, and it's in order to be successful, you have to keep track.
I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's true in every other profession.
Right. So in your role at Bates College now, you're creating content for the web. And why is content important, and is content still king?
Well, today content goes out across the various platforms, right? On Facebook, on X, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on TikTok. And on the face of it, that looks like you're getting all of these eyes and all of these people are looking at what you're putting out. But people's time is really short today. And I still go back to, my strong belief that it's got to be something unusual or quirky or weird or different, or presented in, a fun, offbeat way for people to click on it. I think we all can relate to the fact that when you see something that's an unusual headline or something different, you kind of want to click on it. Now, sometimes you don't because of the news source, and that kind of goes to the issue of having trusted news sources. But I think a lot of people out there can say when they see just a really offbeat, unusual headline that looks like it's coming from a trusted news source, and I'm not even talking so much in Maine, but just sort of globally, you're curious and you're interested and you might want to click on it. So presenting content that is, compelling, deep, interesting, unusual, different, that you want to catch people's attention.
Right. And of course, we're saying that content is king, but to a great extent, Google is also king. And I know that Google is more likely to send people to websites that have fresh content. If your website just sits there for days or months or years without any new content, Google's going to say, oh, they don't update their website. It must not be a very good website. So we're not sending searchers there. Whereas Google is much more likely to send searchers to a site that has fresh content. So to a great degree, anybody who has a website now should almost think of themselves as being in the news business and add news to their site. And I think that's why colleges are hiring people like you now who are used to generating a lot of content. And there are a lot of skills that daily journalists have. It doesn't take you months to generate an article. Like you said, you could generate an article or a story in 3 or 4 hours. So
you're exactly right. And it's amazing how many people just in the last 6 months I've been at Bates, friends, family, associates, doctors that I visited, who I share what I'm doing now, and they don't know. And I say, well, colleges today have news sites, and it's not the student paper, it's the college that's putting out news about the college and the college community, the alumni, the faculty, the research they're doing, the students, the research the students are doing, and even fun, quirky. Like the Bates Trashin' Show that's going to be on 207 tonight.
Oh boy, yeah, great.
It's the content where they make clothes from trash.
Yeah, that's great.
To encourage sustainability. So there's an important mission behind it and an important message behind it, but that's just straight up a fun story.
Yes,
So even those sorts of features are going on college news sites, and we're putting that content on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. That's something new that I'm doing now that somebody else did at the Press Herald, but is really fun, is writing that text for that social media content.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, we would call it content marketing or thought leadership. I mean, of course, colleges want to position themselves as a place where a lot of thought leaders either are attending the school as students or on the faculty. So I think thought leadership is an important aspect of marketing a college. And actually, we do a lot of it at Marshall Communications as well. I mean, that's actually one of the reasons that we're doing the podcast and having thought leaders like you on the podcast.
Very cool. Do you happen to know, is there another podcast like this somewhere in the country or in the world?
There are other PR podcasts, yes. But I think what differentiates this podcast is the emphasis on personal branding with PR. Because I think back in the day, PR was more like an institutional profession where you were promoting an institution or an organization. And then I feel now promoting people as individuals and helping them identify their superpower and communicate their superpower. That's my interest. And that's really kind of the theme that runs throughout this podcast. So we're going to take a break right now. We'll be back with more from Deirdre Stires. And I just want to remind everybody who's listening that you can get the first chapter of my book, Grow Your Audience, Grow Your Brand, by going to prmaven.com/giveaway and sign up for our email list. And then we'll send you the first chapter. And after a short video, we'll be back with more from Deirdre.
Sprague & Curtis is a locally owned real estate company. We're primarily focused in central Maine. I got excited about Nancy's book because she's so well known in the area for her marketing and branding techniques, and we're always looking to expand and learn and grow. And so a lot of us here at the office decided that we wanted to read her book and learn some new techniques.
It benefits Sprague & Curtis to have a large brand and audience because there can often be multiple years between transactions with clients. So it's important to network with them and stay in touch with them in those in-between periods. And this book really helped us learn some techniques and methods to continue to do that. We organized a small book group with Nancy's book with brokers in our office this winter to share information and remind ourselves how important it is to always be working on our network and continually reaching out to our customers.
Platforms like social media are important in expanding your business, but equally as important are handwritten notes, cards, letters. She inspired me to send her a note of appreciation, just thanking her for the book and her insight. In reading Nancy's book, I was excited to look to continue to grow our brand and our audience. I think she does a great job of motivating us.
Nancy's book really helped me learn a few things in marketing and branding and how important it is to stay on top of reaching out to clients periodically, staying top of mind, providing useful information, and really telling our story as a company.
Welcome back, and we're here on the PR Maven Podcast with Deirdre Stires, who's a content creator at Bates College now. And speaking of content, Deirdre, what kind of content do you consume every day?
Well, up until 6 months ago when I was at the Press Herald, as a journalist, I obviously read a lot of media and was on Twitter, X, looking at posts from national park and outdoor organizations, just always looking for story ideas from different organizations. And I still now my focus isn't so Maine, New England, it's more national. So I am reading other newspapers from across the country, and also looking at college websites, as we talked about before. They have news sites, not obviously to get stories that apply to Bates, or sometimes they apply to Bates, but sort of to see what other people are doing to look for a different approach, a different way to approach a story, or to, see what trends are going on where there might be a story.
Right, exactly. But yeah, I think that for PR people and journalists alike, it's just important to stay on top of what's going on and also consume different kinds of media. Like, maybe a sports journalist or a PR person might want to look at Rolling Stone and see what's happening in the music industry. Or
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really important to be somehow plugged into pop culture. And I'm looking forward, as I'm just starting at Bates, but to get to know the students and to learn from them and to find out what trends and things they're interested in. I just finished Michelle Obama's first book, Becoming, and she jokes in it how Barack used to call her Joe Public when they were the first family, because she was on TikTok or she was on YouTube videos, and she's doing push-ups with Ellen DeGeneres on TV. And it's not like I want to replicate that or follow in her stead, but she was doing that to get her message out, that she wanted to raise awareness about childhood obesity and childhood health, and helping underserved communities, helping the youth from those get into colleges. But she was always trying to do it in a way, and the way she put a YouTube video of creating a national garden at the White House to encourage childhood obesity. She was really plugged into pop culture and trying to find ways to get her message out that way. So I'm hoping to learn a lot from the students at Bates.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great recommendation is Michelle's book. I did read that also and really enjoyed it. But I do think also that if you are kind of like current with what's happening, you can connect with more people because you become more relatable. And, if you also come to your relationships with that curious mind that you have, I think people love to tell you about themselves and what they're up to. So I know the students will enjoy chatting with you.
Yeah. And along that point, Nancy, while social media has sort of taken over all of our lives, and it's, everything in moderation, you don't really want to spend your life on social media, but you really do learn about, especially like in Maine. Maine is such a small community. I found so many outdoor story ideas on social media because of what people were posting. And even if it's not a story I pursued, you're aware of what they're talking about. You've got to know what the people out around you are talking about. And social media lets you know about what people all across the state are talking about. So it's a very useful tool.
I agree. I agree. Absolutely. I sometimes say I feel like social media was created just for me so I could socialize 24/7. But honestly, I do feel like it's a great way for brands like Bates, or, I work with the State of Maine Tourism Office. It's a great way for brands to keep an ongoing dialogue going with their targeted audiences, basically. So, Deirdre, why is it important to be a good writer when you're doing content creation?
I think the same reason that it's really useful to be an excellent photographer. I mean, we're not all great photographers, but it's the presentation, right? And if you see a post that is not really very legible, you're not going to be inclined to read it. It's a red flag. If you read something and it's poorly written, it's a huge red flag. And it also might even make you just question, did they even fact check it? If they didn't take the time to write something legibly and well and clear, maybe they didn't even fact check it, and it's just a red flag. You're not really going to trust that news source. I think photos go hand in hand with that. As I was coming to the end of my journalism career, I just think organizations that have good photographers, or people who can even come away with getting, a halfway decent photo, is they're great avenues for pulling people into a post, getting them to click on the post or go to your website.
Right. Absolutely. I think you make a very good point about if there's typos or grammatical errors that it just looks like it was thrown together. Although I have to admit, sometimes I post things and I've got typos, and then I look back, it's like, oh, let me edit that. And yeah, it's embarrassing. So you do need to take a breath when you're posting and make sure that it's correct and spelled correctly also. So we already talked about the book by Michelle Obama called Becoming. Is there another book, an app, or a website that you have found useful in your career or your life, and why?
Well, there's a few. Most recently, now that I am writing a lot of content for the social media posts, I use, I think it's called wordcounter.net, but it's really a character counter. And so, I mean, it's especially helpful for X if you're putting a post on X where you can only have so many characters, which includes the link to the story or to the news site. It just helps you. Well, we're also pressed for time today. It helps you craft the post for social media even faster. And I mentioned it before, but I have found when I'm reporting and I'm gathering details for stories, taking photographs or videos is, I obviously record if I'm doing an interview and I take notes, but just taking photos, you don't remember sometimes what you see. And it's amazing if you can go back to a photo or a video to see how someone spoke or the mannerisms that they used. And, I'm wondering, sometimes you get photos sent from PR agencies. I mean, you often do if you ask for photos, but I'm wondering now maybe why that didn't, especially the smaller organizations, again, where there's people at nonprofits working 3 to 4 jobs at the nonprofit, and they're trying to get you to do a story on their organization, to send photos or videos, just it's maybe saving the reporter time. It's maybe intriguing them more, where they'd be more apt to do a story on that. I just think there's a lot of value in, in the photos and videos that you can collect around a story or a message that you're trying to send. And just one last on books, because I am, when I can be, an avid reader. And I realized in recent years that the genre, I never sort of realized this, but I've been migrating to this genre more and more. And now it's often all I read is biographies and autobiographies. And they're amazing if you're telling a story, because they really oftentimes, the good ones are about a story within a story. Like, I'm not a Bruce Springsteen fan, but his writing is amazing, like very lyrical, just such a pleasure to read. But also it's a lot of that, his story is about mental illness, which he goes into that and you wouldn't expect. And it's just got a really powerful message about navigating that journey if you're dealing with mental illness. Another one that when I had COVID that I reread was Walter Isaacson's biography on Steve Jobs, which was amazing, so interesting. But it was this really complex portrait of a guy who basically was an asshole, just so mean, such a bully to people, and really just had a small community of family and friends who tolerated his outbursts. But you couldn't deny that he was a genius. And in his own way, he was trying to help the world. He was trying to help people. He was trying to sort of help the everyday person be more creative and have this amazing, easy experience on Macs. So it's just, autobiographies and biographies are a great way to find kind of the story in the story. And those are the sorts of pitches, again, I think are really strong for PR agencies trying to get reporters to do stories on whatever it is they're pitching. Is just, sometimes there's a backstory, and the backstory is the most interesting part of the event or the person or whatever it might be.
Well, that kind of goes back to the whole theme we started with personal branding. And, a human interest story does sort of tell a story of what makes a person unique and interesting. And I too love biographies and autobiographies because I'm so curious about people. And I think we all are naturally.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's that as well. People stories. It's just human nature, I think, to want to learn from other people. It inspires us. It encourages us. It makes us feel a little bit better. Maybe if we're going through a hard time, to see that we're not alone and other people have gone through it. It's just really human nature to be drawn to very well told stories about other people.
I agree. Yeah. Well, Deirdre, this has been so great. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. And I think that everybody in PR Maven Nation will enjoy learning from you and the lessons that you've shared. So thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely. It's always great to be with you, Nancy.
Yeah. So I want to share that again, if you go to prmaven.com/giveaway, you can get the first chapter of Grow Your Audience, Grow Your Brand, which does get into how you can create content that will grow your brand. So I encourage you to sign up for the first chapter of that. And Deirdre, thanks again. And I hope everybody has a great day in PR Maven Nation.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the PR Maven Podcast. I invite you to share a review of the podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcast player. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. You can also join the PR Maven Nation on Facebook. It's free to join, and it's a great community of like-minded individuals who are all looking to learn and grow from one another. If you use an Alexa device, use your Alexa app to search the Skills and Games section to find and enable the PR Maven Podcast Flash Briefing. This will give you access to exclusive content and more PR and marketing advice. Thanks again for listening, and have a great rest of your week, PR Maven Nation.